Five Generations of Makers, Julie Hooker, 2022. Five Generations is a set of 5 woven plant-based vessels depicting the long line of makers that I belong to and the skills I've inherited from my grandmothers and mother. I've included this wonderful photograph of the 5 generations stood together in the exhibition. From the top left to right you can see my great-great-grandmother Nanny Mac, then my mother, my Nanny Peggy, her mother Nani Williams, and then myself in the middle at the front. My sisters being held by Nanny Peggy at the back. Each vessel was made in a very similar way to each other, but with the details that make them unique, just like a family, clearly related yet individual. And each vessel shows the individual maker's skills. I came up with many ideas for materials to make the structures, and I came to the conclusion that I'd like to keep the structures the same material-wise, and would also like to continue with the roots narrative of the pieces for continuity. To do this, I chose to use preserved snapdragon plants from my garden, which is a plant that we all grow as a family. It's one of family favourites. And I chose to leave the roots in situ when I dug them up to keep the narrative going with the roots and family ties and growth. The first vessel is for my great-great-grandmother, Violet Lydia, Nanny Mac. Nanny Mac was my great-great-grandmother. She was a knitter and somewhat of an enigma. She also enjoyed making scrapbooks, making one for all the babies in the family. I still have mine, and it's a reminder of how much she loved making, and it's probably the first example I saw of memories being captured in a craft. There's a lovely message inside that reads, "To Julie with love, etc." from Nanny Mac. Everything in the scrapbook relates to the year I was born, the fashion, the food and the advertisements. They're all very mundane, but they capture the era perfectly. It's obviously something she spent quite a lot of time on. I think Nanny was probably the first to make for enjoyment rather than out of necessity. Nanny was also a great knitter. She used to knit all her own jumpers, but also some very elaborate knitted suits. And I remember as a child, it looked like she was knitting at about 100 miles an hour. She only really ever stopped for a banana and sugar sandwich and a sip of tea. So Nanny's vessel is designed to showcase her love of knitting, and the neatly knitted stocking stitch band above the top of the vessel kind of shows her style of very neat, precise knitting. The scrapbooking is represented by these small flowered scraps that I made by neatly cutting them out of the handmade paper after they were embroidered, and then they're applied just as you would in a scrapbook. The vessel I've called Violet after her, and I think it goes some way to showcasing her skills well. I'm going to move on to her daughter's vessel now, Jean M. Nani Williams. Nani Williams was my great-grandmother. When I remember her, she lived with Nanny Mac after her husband had passed away and shared her garden and house in Woolwich. Nan was a stitcher, and she created beautiful embroideries and cross-stitch pictures. She also joined her mother in high-speed knitting. I've used cross stitches to embellish the paper liner, hoping to highlight her particular craft skill within her piece. Whilst I was making the vessels, one plant had a snapped branch, which I repaired with a visible repair. I've incorporated this into Nani Williams's piece to symbolise her make-do and mend skills developed during the war. A neat, organised and fastidious lady, she was always immaculately turned out. She always seemed very tall and elegant to me, and she often bought clothes from her favourite store only to return them as they weren't quite right. I've tried to reflect this in the way I constructed the piece, ensuring that the woven base is carefully woven to look prim and neat just as she would like it. The vessel is called Jean. Moving along we have Margaret Jean, my Nanny Peggy. Nanny Peggy is the dressmaker in the family and passed her sewing skills to me via my mother. As a child she was an evacuee, which was something she hated, and as a young woman she worked in a high-class millinery shop in London, modelling the hats in the showroom for celebrity customers. She had some training in millinery, but sadly had to give it up when she had my mother. Her sense of style, however, which was undoubtedly forged then, remains an inspiration to me. Nan taught my mum to sew when she was expecting me, and then she in turn taught me. When my daughter was born, she stitched a beautiful cross-stitch of Noah's Ark that my daughter still has hanging in her room. The piece I've made for Nanny hints at her dressmaking skills. I've used strips of pinked paper and neat straight stitching to embellish the paper liner. Again, the piece is worked in a neat and precise way, as this is the way she is, like her mother, Nani Williams. Everything must be just so. This time I've constructed the woven base using leaves with a slight stripe that reminds us all of her love of the Breton-style top and her smart appearance. There are also a couple of bands of tied cordage around the bottom of the piece, symbolising the string used to tie her luggage when she was an evacuee. Unsurprisingly, I'm calling this vessel Peggy. So now we move on to my penultimate vessel, Susan Margaret Ann, my mum. My mum is a knitwear designer and spinner. She dyes and spins her own wool, which has always been fascinating to me. She has definitely been the most significant influence on me in my textile journey. We share a love of traditional crafts and a rather crazy sense of humour. When my sister and I were younger, we regularly attended craft shows with Mum, art exhibitions, rural life museums and textile events. In the 1980s and early 90s, she used to organise craft fairs. At this time they were at their peak. My sister and I used to help set up and man the door, and she introduced us to a huge range of artisans who were so generous with their time and so patient with two very inquisitive little girls. Whilst I was doing my A-levels when I was younger, Mum studied machine knitting and design at City and Guilds level, becoming the first of us to finish a form of textile-related studies. Her vessel's decoration is based on the knit-weave coat that she made, her final piece for City and Guilds, shown here. The African-style zigzag and other similar motifs are a favourite of hers, and she deploys them regularly within her work. I've made Mum's vessel to be a lot more textured than the previous ones, as even more than me, Mum loves a really high relief and a crunchy texture. The wilder looking the better, really. Mum puts this down to a rebellion against the neatness and order of her mother and grandmother. I've tried to capture her zest for life and exuberance within the piece as well. It has a chunky knitted band around the centre of the piece with a fine woven base to it. The paper liner is embroidered with the zigzag motif that she likes so much. I'm hoping she's going to like it, and I've got a feeling I might have lost this one. It'll be winging its way to her home near the sea in Eastbourne. So now we'll move on to my last piece, mine. My vessel is an amalgamation of all the others really, just as I am. It's very textured yet neatly constructed, but I must say slightly unfinished and a little dishevelled. I've showcased my cordage and paper in this vessel and hinted at my love of plants by the use of dried flowers and seed heads woven into the base. I've embroidered the paper liner with pattern of tree branches, which is very reminiscent of the embroidery on the sycamore hanging from last year. It's just a simple straight machine stitch that I use a lot to create backgrounds and draw motifs in my work. I really enjoy the wild look of the piece. I've purposely left areas that aren't as woven as the others, and also lots of loose ends. I really do enjoy a kind of unfinished look. One of my tutors called my style intentionally unfinished at one point, which I thought was wonderful, and I really enjoy that idea. I think one of the nicest things about researching for these pieces has been chatting to my mum and my nan about the family. Nan's been going through the family photos with Mum, and they found some real gems along the way. Mum thinks that some of them probably haven't seen the light of day for at least 30 years. And it's been great for them to discuss their past and their grandparents and mothers. I think it's brought us all a bit closer together, really. I've now had the chance to show everything to my daughter, who's asked for copies of the photographs to keep for the future. I think it's been a great chance for me to tell some of the stories to her, hoping that she'll carry it forward to the generations that are yet to come. Certainly in my private view, I overheard a few conversations where people were talking about their grandparents, prompted by the pieces, which I thought was wonderful.